Hey, I'm some nobody, and my favorite movie of all time is John Carpenter's The Thing. It's not just my favorite horror movie and my favorite science fiction movie, like I said, it's top one for me. The distance between John Carpenter's The Thing and my number 2 favorite movie of all time is astronomical. The Thing is a film that is fantastic after your first watch, but only gets better the more times you rewatch it. It's a tense movie that'll sink its hooks into you even when you know every single thing that happens in the film. It's such a high quality film that it's the number 1 movie for proving horror haters wrong. Here's a little pro tip for all my horror fans out there that want to get their friends into horror, but their friends are big anti-horror people. Here's how you hook them. You tell them, hey, you know how in a lot of horror movies characters kind of have to act dumb to progress the plot forward? Well, The Thing is a movie full of smart characters who mostly make reasonable decisions based on the situation that they're in, but the situation that they're in is so insurmountable that it really doesn't matter. That's going to get them interested in the movie 99% of the time. But let me restrain myself for a moment because this video is not a full-on review of The Thing and it's not a scene-by-scene breakdown of the movie. This video is more of a one-man discussion about a very common takeaway that a lot of people have after watching the film. So I humbly request, if you have not seen John Carpenter's The Thing, please go watch it before you watch this video. Because from here on out, I'm going to be dropping spoilers with no regard for who hears them. And I think more importantly, you should be forming your own opinions and interpretations from the movie. I don't want this to be a I tell you how to think video. So with the preamble out of the way, let's actually get started. Hey, I see you back there, guy who hasn't seen the movie. Grab that guy, take him outside. Alright, so now that the only people still around are people who have seen the movie, we can get started for real. John Carpenter's The Thing is 42 years old. Now the movie's age doesn't really matter because it's a timeless classic, but I mention it because that means you can find perspectives on this film across 4 different decades. From the original 1982 film reviews to articles about The Thing written in the 2010s to modern day video essays, people have been talking about this movie for a long time. And yet after 42 years of discussion and analysis, I've never seen anybody have the perspective that I've come to have on the film as of late. You see, I think the most common takeaway that people have with John Carpenter's The Thing, whether they're criticizing it or praising it, is that the film is bleak and or nihilistic. And I totally understand this perspective because I feel like anybody who has seen the film can understand this perspective. The men of Outpost 31 are caught in an utterly hopeless situation, trapped in an Arctic research station with a highly intelligent alien life form that can perfectly replicate humans and any other living species. And despite Roger Ebert's suggestions of a buddy system, by the time they know what they're up against, it's already too late to know for a fact that no one's been infected. Hey, knowing my luck, I'd get buddied up with the infected guy. I'd rather just be alone. But despite their best efforts, none of the men of Outpost 31 make it out alive. Now the movie is open-ended with several different interpretations as to what happens to MacReady and Childs as the credits start rolling. And whether or not you believe Childs is a thing, and whether or not you believe MacReady has a flamethrower hidden underneath his blanket to deal with Childs' thing, the fact of the matter is all of these men die. And I know there are video game and comic sequels where MacReady survives, but I do not care. The comics are contradicted by the video game. The video game is officially Carpenter endorsed, but Carpenter has also said things in public that have contradicted the video game, so I don't care about anything but the original film. Point is that no matter how you slice it, the thing ends with everyone died and maybe it was for nothing. Strong possibility that they didn't completely destroy the thing and it's going to wind up assimilating the entire world. But despite that, after my last couple rewatches, I don't really see this movie as a bleak and nihilistic one. I've kind of come to see it as a hopeful movie, or maybe even inspiring. I've started to feel like this is a movie that condemns individualism and reminds us that human beings are at their strongest when they stand together. And I think that idea is present even in the very early parts of the movie. Before we're even exposed to any horrors, we can see that the men of Outpost 31 are already kinda tired of each other. We can primarily see this through the fact that MacReady is so desperate for privacy he'd rather live in a shack in Arctic conditions instead of living in the outpost with everybody else. And then it's shown a bit more plainly once the dog thing is just roaming around the base. When the men of Outpost 31 are all in the rec room talking, playing games together, and generally acting like a community, the dog thing is powerless to do anything other than aggravate Benning's gunshot wound. But this shadowy bastard that's either Palmer or Norris, who just wants some time to himself, is easy pickings for the beast. I mentioned earlier that a buddy system wouldn't work, but community systems are very effective against the thing. The thing would have had a much harder time with Outpost 31 if the men there weren't already pre-divided for it. Think about it, when the dog thing is put into the kennel with the other dogs, it winds up getting itself killed because it tries to attack a community all at once. The dogs that aren't being actively assimilated alert the men of the outpost, who promptly kill the dog thing. Later on, when Bennings is caught lacking by the Two-Face thing, they immediately kill Bennings thing. R.I.P. Bennings, but what that ultimately means is that if it weren't for this little window of time where somebody needed some time to themselves, they would have killed every version of the thing in the outpost right off the bat. If everybody had just hung out together that first day, there wouldn't be a threat by day 2. But I'm not saying it's a hopeful movie just because hanging out, smoking weed, filling our bellies with diet soda, and playing Burnout Revenge for the PS2 would have saved the day. I think the movie really gets hopeful when you delve into the thing's two biggest weaknesses that aren't the fact it can't 1v all a group. I believe from a personal standpoint, the thing's greatest weakness is also its ultimate goal, and that is self-preservation. The thing will do whatever it takes to avoid being destroyed. The 3 members of the outpost that the thing successfully assimilated and masqueraded as were Palmer, Norris, and Dr. Blair. Now obviously we aren't fully privy to the true nature of the thing, whether or not it's a hive mind and what it got up to before each of these things were revealed to be things. We know that Blair thing spent most of his time assimilated building a spaceship as a means to escape the camp, which you could argue is reasonable because Blair was locked in the tool shed, so it's not like he can actively help the other 2 things inside the outpost. But interestingly enough, we do get to see Palmer thing actively hinder Norris thing by alerting MacReady and Windows to Norris thing's attempt at escape, which I believe is Palmer thing attempting to keep his scent off the trail. Now the Norris scene is important because it's the scene that gives MacReady the idea that every individual piece of the thing is its own sentient being with its own desire to survive. Now I suppose you could make some kind of argument that Norris's head abandoning Norris's body is something about the thing not standing with itself, but I think the bigger issue for the thing is that Norris's head trying to survive gives MacReady huge information against the rest of the things. Now it's not exactly 1-to-1, but Norris's head trying to escape is basically a goon giving up all the information on their boss to try and avoid being killed by the hero or the US government, whatever you want to call them. If Norris thing had just bravely sat on that table and died for his country, the whole schism would have tipped back in the thing's favor. Because then MacReady wouldn't have any kind of plan going forward, he would just have to go back to holding the whole base hostage with dynamite. But because Norris thing doesn't do that, we lead into the blood testing scene. And once again, the individual thing's self-preservation does great harm to the bigger thing community. These little blood things prioritize their own survival over the survival of the whole society that's pretending to be Palmer. Every single part of the thing, down to the molecule, is its own individual being, and not a single one of them has the guts, the backbone, or the cojones to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And that segues pretty well into the next weakness of the thing. Humans aren't like that. With the other things and its spaceship destroyed, Blair thing ultimately decides to take out the generator and then take a nap in the ice until more humans come to find it. And it's at that point where the remaining survivors of Outpost 31 say, "We're not making it out of this one, but neither is he." They don't make desperate bids for their own individual survival that probably won't work anyway. They stand together and say, "We're going scorched earth in this motherfucker." They recognize that they aren't important. They need to do this for the greater good. These men have saved the planet. It's what made the irony of me portraying MacReady as a villain in that true crime gimmick I made so delicious. Because a bunch of dudes at a research station stopped a planet-ending threat, and nobody will ever know about it because to do it they had to eliminate all chances of their own survival. But let me wrap this all up in a bow for you so you can maybe understand why I think The Thing is more of a hopeful movie than a nihilistic one. We have a monster that is at its strongest when mankind is divided. divided, but can't really do anything to us when we stand together. It preys upon distrust and falters in the face of community. The thing itself represents division. It splits itself into so many different parts and none of them work together. And as a matter of fact, the individual parts of the thing that it's divided itself into will actively cannibalize each other just to try and get ahead. A metaphorical cannibalism there, not in the way that the thing actually eats living things. And ultimately, this monster that represents division is defeated by a group of men putting their differences and their distrust aside to stand together and recognize that they are fighting for something bigger than themselves. And at the end of the movie, when it's just Childs MacReady sitting in the burned out remains of Outpost 31, they drop their distrust again and share a drink, and MacReady can't help but laugh at the situation they're in. So now, after God knows how many times I've rewatched this movie, my biggest takeaway from The Thing is this: the indomitable human spirit
wins again.